All right, we're on the air. My name is Luke Johnson, and I'm from the Noetic Philosophy, Poetry, Humanities Teaching app. Go download it right now. We're doing, I believe, what is this, our fourth installment of Kant's Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason. And we're doing a little something new. We're actually involving, this is going to be a conversation between three individuals today. And so, as usual, there is Matthew William Brake, and our guest today is a fellow named Joseph. I can't pronounce your last name yet, Joseph, so I'm just going to let you pronounce your own last name and tell everybody why you're such an important person to this conversation. Joseph is a Kant scholar, and he's going to help us clarify some of the things that maybe we didn't introduce with enough specificity, and help us sort of get some separation with some of these difficult concepts at the end of the Theodicy essay and in the prefaces. So, Joseph, tell the people who you are.
Hello, my name's Joseph Trullinger. I'm a assistant professor of honors in philosophy at George Washington University in D.C. I've been there since 2014, the fall of 2014. Really like my job quite a lot. That's how I met Matt, who had the dubious honor of taking a seminar of mine on Spinoza and the Spinozism controversy. So what is my research mostly focus on? I'm mostly focused on Kant's philosophy of religion, how he thought ethics led inevitably to religion, something that he says in the text that we're going to be discussing today. I also have an interest in Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School of Critical Social Thought, and a recent interest in German Romanticism and liberation theology. So that, I suppose, is enough about myself. One thing I want to make sure I say before launching into our discussion is that there are lots of competing interpretations of Kant in general. Kant is like an ocean. There's so many different possible ways of taking Kant. He's such a rich thinker. He's also such a terrible stylist. So interpreting what he's saying is a lot of work. But it's rewarding work. Anyway, that being said, the interpretation I take of Kant is that he is not reducing religion down to morality and thereby offering a kind of crypto-atheism or a crypto-humanism. That is not the mainstream interpretation of Kant's religion. A lot of people take Kant's religion to be very, very weakly or anemically influenced by Christianity. It sort of hollows out what's legitimately religious within the tradition and is sort of a hinge figure to sort of modern humanistic atheism. So it should be said that my view on a lot of this stuff is not the mainstream scholarly interpretation, and there's lots of very strong reasons to interpret Kant the way that he's been interpreted in the mainstream. So I just want viewers to sort of know that you can't just take what I say as being indisputable, even if you got that impression.
Well, I think the tone that we set with this Noetic product is that we try to get as close to the accuracy of what the thinker is saying, but that there are inevitably going to be mistakes because, I mean, we're sort of, fighting our way through a lot of these texts. And that was something, I wanted you to say something maybe a little bit about this great blog that you've put together, Two Untruths. I've really enjoyed sampling it here and there and how you explore some of these issues. If we can just give a little promotion for that. And then I do believe you have a few published papers on these subjects. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So I have a few publications on Kant's philosophy of religion. One, probably the one that I'm most known for, is Kant's Two Touchstones for Conviction in Review of Metaphysics. There I argue that I basically unpack what Kant means when he says that morality leads inevitably to religion, and how he thought that there were two basic ways of testing one's conviction, whether one could communicate it or whether one could sort of wager one's self-respect on it. So that's probably what is my biggest publication. I have a few other publications, like on Kant and Job. I get a lot of mileage out of Kant's reading of Job, actually. I talk about it pretty often. And also some publications on Marcuse that are going to be coming out. I don't know exactly when. I have one in Radical Philosophy Review. And I also have a blog that I started this summer called Between Two Untruths, or www.twountruths.com. It's just easier to get to, in which I reflect on a number of things, but mostly ethico-theology, which is a term Kant uses to talk about how one proceeds from ethics that is open to anybody of any sort of tradition, no matter what the religious background, to a certain, what he calls moral religion. So that kind of strain interests me, and how it's taken up not only by Kant himself, but thinkers before Kant and after Kant. So a big part of what I stump for is that there is a subterranean Platonic tradition of identifying God as the good that Kant's actually drawing from, and then after Kant, you see thinkers like Emmanuel Levinas saying similar things. Anyway, was that sufficient? Was that good?
Yeah, I think that's sufficient. And I have to say this before we get into everything. Despite the fact that you have so closely read Kant, you have not inherited his terrible writing style. You are a beautiful writer, and I really have enjoyed reading your blog, and I highly recommend everyone checking it out. Like, I maybe sometime, maybe off camera or another point or something like that, I'd love to know about your aesthetic influences, your stylistic influences, and how you were able to resist this Prussian's influence.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's a very nice compliment. Thank you very much. Hopefully people don't have too inflated an expectation. All right, so shall we talk about Kant?
Yeah, we should. And something I wanted to do before we got in there, you were mentioning off camera, I don't know, so my area of expertise, if any of us are ever experts, right, we're always constantly learning and finding new things that improve our understanding. My background's primarily in Kierkegaard. My interpretations of Kant and Hegel and individuals that surround Kierkegaard is through his lens. Now, does Kierkegaard properly interpret those individuals? Does he even make reference to them by name? Does he get it right? So it's very possible, and also I have a limited understanding of Kant. It's been a while since I really touched on him. Mm-hmm. I kind of went nakedly without really a lot of baggage going into this particular text. And I wanted to know if there were things that jumped out at you that were just had to be rectified right now, like as something that just you felt like we didn't perhaps address with enough clarity in previous installments. And I'm totally okay with this criticism. I'm kind of just learning and growing with everybody else, and I think that's very important to demonstrate in these forums, because I want people to not feel like they have to be experts in order to have philosophical conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I haven't had a chance to watch through all of the previous installments of you guys reflecting on Kant. Matt gave some really good background to the orientation essay that you were discussing. One thing I think I caught at the end of, I want to say, that broadcast was you talking very briefly about whether Kant was sort of being genuinely Christian by sort of, I think maybe you might have been talking about the title of the book, Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, whether that kind of connotes a restriction, an undue restriction of what Kant thinks religion can mean. Is that correct? I mean, I'd rather...
I do so much work that I can't keep track of all of it. I could have said something like that, but why? Go ahead and issue the clarification.
Yeah, okay. So I think one thing that is really useful when approaching this book by Kant is to understand that it comes out of decades of thinking on his part about these issues. So this is one of Kant's later works, and Kant's most famous book, The Critique of Pure Reason, published in 1781, he was already especially for his time period, a relatively old man by the time he became widely known. And he has many, many books that he wrote throughout his life that we didn't read, in which he's entertained all sorts of different philosophical positions. And one thing that's interesting about the religion book is that Kant is presupposing that you're already on board with the arguments that he's been hashing out regarding what morality is, what the supreme principle of morality is, his famous categorical imperative, all of that. And I think one thing that often happens is, for us readers nowadays, is we lack the same sort of intellectual context that Kant had and that he was writing in and responding to. And lacking that historical knowledge, we can very easily come into these texts thinking that they're speaking to us in ways that they aren't, or that they're neglecting things that we actually would like to see. So one thing that I think often happens is Kant gets sort of misread as being very intellectualist. So when he talks about reason, a lot of people think that he is talking about some very cerebral, Mr. Spock kind of conception of a human being, literally inhuman. And what he actually means by reason in this kind of context is practical reason. Reason not relating to us as knowers, but to us as doers. So one thing that I think is often missed is just how existential Kant is. You wouldn't know it from his writing style, but he was very influenced by Rousseau. He thought of Rousseau as, he called Rousseau the Newton of the moral world. He thought that Rousseau and Rousseau's critique of the Enlightenment had tapped into something very, very important, very pivotal, that we cannot equate culture with morality, or that we cannot equate civilization with morality. And instead, a lot of these sort of problems that we have of becoming a good person cannot simply just be farmed out to experts. But instead, there was a capacity within each and every person, no matter how much or how little education they had, to reflect on these things for themselves and subject them to what he calls critique. Critique there, of course, not just being negative, critique coming from the Greek meaning to parcel out, to divide up, in German, Urteil. Urteil is judgment. To sort of subject things to judgment, see what fits with what. He thought that anybody had the capacity to do this, and it actually also does not matter what your IQ level is either. I think that's a very common misunderstanding of reason too. In Kant, people think that when he's talking about the rational person, he means a highly intelligent person, but he's often stressing that practical reason has nothing to do with IQ. All it has to do with is, can you set an end for yourself? Can you set your own goals? And in other words, free will. So when Kant says practical reason, he means the will, and specifically free will, or what we hope is free will. Again, for Kant, as you guys have talked about, we cannot know whether we have free will or not. It's not the sort of thing we can ascertain, like empirical facts. So we have to act on the conviction that we have free will, even though we can never have this conviction confirmed through any theoretical evidence. It also means it can't be disconfirmed. It means that there's no theoretical evidence or empirical evidence that could refute that we have free will, despite what the neuroscientists, or at least popular interpretations of neuroscience, are often telling us.
I see. I think Matt has a question for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, going back to sort of our corrections from previous podcasts, there were two issues that I'm most self-conscious about from our previous installments of this series. One was the issue of concepts, which we talked about a little before the show.
Yeah.
Like at one point I was talking about what a concept is, and then I brought in time determination, and now that I'm reading through the first critique again with some friends, I'm like, I'm not sure I got that right, and I wasn't sure in the moment that I got it right. So can you sum up, I mean, it's Kant, but can you sum up that issue of like where I might have stumbled there with the issue of concepts and talking about what a concept is. And then I have one follow-up question after that from the Theodicy essay.
Yeah. Okay, so, excuse me, very basically, there is a difference between concepts and ideas for Kant. And it starts kind of gaining traction with the issue of the phenomenal and the noumenal. So you've got various terms in Kant. One of these terms is representation. In German, Vorstellung. And Vorstellung is the German translation of what Locke called in English ideas. It's just something between your ears, something in your mind, something that is within your consciousness. Okay, but you can't translate Vorstellung as idea into English because we need to save that for Idee in German, which gets translated as idea. And this is like a Platonic form, a Platonic idea. And these are things that we can have no experience of. Okay. As we're going to see, they can nonetheless be extraordinarily important, both for our attempts to comprehend the world as a whole, the task of theoretical reason, or to instantiate freedom in the world, the task of practical reason. So these are different than concepts. Concepts are rules for organizing representations, and we develop ideas out of the concepts, trying to basically kind of organize all our concepts together. But one thing that we come to find out is that there are certain ideas that we just can't give any sort of determinate, get any sort of determinate handle on, like the world as a whole. When did time begin? Where does space end? These are questions that Kant begins the first preface to the first edition of the First Critique this way, that human reason, by its very nature, poses questions to itself which it cannot answer. Concepts, generally, though, for Kant, are rules for organizing things. So concepts like cause and effect, those are concepts. Where do those come from? They don't come from the world itself, according to Kant. They are generated by a mental faculty or power, Vermögen. I kind of like Pluhar's translation of Vermögen as power. Faculty makes it sound like faculty psychology, and it's not what Kant means. So anyway, there's a power within the mind called the understanding. There's another power in the mind called sensibility. And there's another power in the mind called reason. So sensibility, it's pretty obvious. It's our ability to receive sense impressions. The understanding, however, generates concepts. And it does this a priori, or independently of experience. And it's through those self-generated concepts that provide structure and order to our experience. It's through the self-generation of those concepts and the reception of sense impressions, hashed out through the imagination in what Kant calls a sort of thing that straddles both of these, called schemata. Please don't ask me to explain that section of the First Critique. We get this ordered whole called experience. And this is why experience is not, in James's phrase, a blooming, buzzing confusion, but is rational, makes sense, admits of causal connections that we can predict and understand without it being one great colossal coinky-dink like in Hume.
So,
yeah.
On that note, so I brought up time determination. I know time itself is an intuition. Space and time are. Time determination, though, the idea that we see this here, then this here, then this here. Did I mix concept with intuition then?
I think you may have, yeah. So intuition is something that pertains to sensibility. So according to Kant, what an intuition is something that it's a sort of mental representation that is immediate, that is instantaneous, And for Kant, these can only ever be, for finite minds, they can only ever be empirical. Okay? So for Kant, when he uses intuition, he basically means sensible, empirical intuition. There is a different kind of intuition that is at least thinkable, called intellectual intuition. But that is something, he says, we would have to have an infinite mind in order to have. In other words, we would have to be God. If God exists, God has intellectual intuitions. And that is where God has content given to him. That's all at once. But he doesn't receive it from anywhere else. So a good example of what Kant means by intellectual intuition, you could find a sort of mythical or symbolic representation of in Genesis. God says, "Let there be light," and there was light. Right? So in other words, God's mind produces the very thing that he then intuits. It's a productive intuition. It's not receptive. Our minds have to receive intuitions in order for us to have them. So this cashes itself out in the distinction between phenomena and noumena. And your question about time determination is going to be relevant here. So for Kant, it's a rule of our minds. It's a rule through which our minds give order to what we call experience, that every event has a cause that precedes it in time. Is the world independent of our minds that way? We can't know. We can't know, according to Kant. We don't know about that. Why? Because, as he argues at the beginning of the first critique, time and space are pure a priori forms of intuition. In other words, they're a kind of lattice onto which we put and give order and structure to the intuitions that come to us from the thing in itself. And there you go, you have understandable, comprehensible experience. Beyond that, though, we can't know whether those things apply. So something like free will, or the idea of being able to decide something without that decision being conditioned by something else, that would have to be noumenal, if it exists. We have no way of confirming that. So free will works outside of what we can understand and comprehend. It works outside of time determination. So even though in our experience, phenomenally, every event has a cause that precedes it in time, that we experience all of our decisions as being conditioned by something. There's something before it in time that produced a certain thought, or there was a certain neuron firing that seems to be associated with us deciding that that chocolate is better than vanilla, or that you ought to marry this person or that person, or whatever the story is. But Kant's hope is that that this is not necessarily the case. And why does he hope for this? Well, he hopes for this because otherwise you can't make sense out of morality. It makes no sense then to say that you ought to have done this and not done that if you couldn't have done otherwise. If you were just fated to decide whatever you decided by prior conditions, prior events, then we can't make sense out of morality. And for Kant, that's inexcusable. Okay. I may have veered way off. Did I help?
Well, I think it's all really helpful. I think the only thing that I'm concerned about, and Joseph, I really can't say where I would get such an elucidation that was so succinct as what you just provided. So I don't think it was way off at all. The only thing that I'm concerned about are very finite, limited time constraints about covering the material that we have set aside for today.
Oh,
so
sure.
I do want to jump into that. But I think Matt had one more. Did you have one more clarification question from last time?
Yeah, I don't know if you could answer this succinctly in a minute or two, but one of the things that me and Luke stumbled over, because he got sick, and when I read it, I got something totally different from when he read it when he got sick, was the concluding remark of the Theodicy essay.
Mm-hmm.
the difference between truth and truthfulness and formal conscientiousness and material conscientiousness? Because when I read it, I read truthfulness and formal conscientiousness as good, and material conscientiousness and truth is bad, sort of like the doctrinal authentic difference in some ways, kind of projecting it onto that. And I'm not sure if I got that right, and I'm not sure if you could clear up those issues.
Yeah.
And if I can introduce something here a little bit, because I went back and I reread this. I believe Matt's making reference to a food poisoning episode that I had. Thanks, Matt. So the thing that I understood, this difference, this divide between doctrinal theodicy and authentic theodicy, and you can totally tell me if I'm wrong about this, is that doctrinal theodicy largely proceeds from speculative reason, and speculative reason, all those theodicy attempts that proceed from ratiocinating reason are doomed to fail for some reason. But this authentic theodicy, one that involves the postulation of the highest good, and we'll talk more about that, and a just, holy, omnipotent, omniscient God to make sure that the highest good obtains in an afterlife, somehow this gives us a more like ethical resolve to go about doing things. And I guess what I'm curious about, it seems like with the formal conscientiousness, there's a truthfulness to it because it understands that like we are somehow either positing these things, making these judgments, whereas material conscientiousness never ventures to make these judgments in the first place. The problem arises with insincerity and there being errors when is not realizing our contribution to these beliefs that we have. Whether they be about the making of experience or the making of our rational faith, and that really it seems like Kant wants us to turn inward and understand that there are all these different faculties that you enumerated, reason, understanding, sensibility, that are making all of this possible, and that it seems like it's a buffer against religious enthusiasm that's just like, I know because it was received and I'm gonna just go out and do it. So that was kind of my understanding of the difference between what it really meant to be honest and sincere and truthful and formal conscientiousness and material conscientiousness. What did I get right? What did I get wrong?
Okay, so I think one of the important things is to see that Kant's drawing a distinction between conscience and conscientiousness. There was a thinker before Kant by the name of Baumgarten, Alexander Baumgarten, who is a Leibnizian and very popular philosopher. Kant used his book on metaphysics and ethics for a lot of his lectures. And Baumgarten said that there can be such a thing as an erring conscience, that your conscience can kind of like tell you to do something and then you can do it and your conscience was wrong. And for Kant, he says this is wrong. So there's a statement in the essay that an erring conscience doesn't exist, or is in German an Unding, a non-thing. It's an unthing. Okay, so Kant is trying to distinguish between conscience on the one hand and conscientiousness. So conscience is reflection on whether or not you have been scrupulous and really examined your situation and whether you have done the right thing. Okay, and you can't be wrong about that, because you can't be wrong about whether you've really been reflective about your situation. You could have got it wrong about what the right thing to do was, but you couldn't be wrong about whether you thought really hard about it and tried really hard to your utmost to figure out the right thing. So that's what he's trying to do there. And then conscientiousness is the degree to which you adhere or listen to your conscience. Does that make sense? So conscientiousness is everybody has conscience. They have to have it to be a moral agent. But not everybody is conscientious. Not everybody is really good about listening to their conscience and following its dictates. And conscience, for Kant, is the voice of God. But
yes, this is fascinating because I had on page 24 through 25, and I'd never really heard that before. This passage, if I may read it,
Sure.
for through our reason, God then becomes himself the interpreter of his will as announced through creation, and we can call this interpretation an authentic theodicy. But that is not the interpretation of ratiocinating speculative reason, but of an efficacious practical reason, which just as in legislative it commands absolutely without further grounds. So it can be considered as the unmediated definition and voice of God through which he gives meaning to the letter of his creation.
Yeah.
I don't hear people talk about Kant like this, and that maybe that goes back to your earlier point about how people want to shoehorn Kant into being this crypto-atheist, but that passage right there to me is like him being like, hallelujah, you know?
Right. Well, so two things. On the one hand, I agree. On the other hand, we have to be very careful how we interpret Kant here. So this is never a sign that we are in touch with the things in themselves. According to Kant, again, right, we can't have intuitions of what goes beyond experience, right? We can only have sensible, empirical intuitions. So that is not to say that God could never reveal himself to us. Kant actually never denies that. It's that if God revealed himself to us, like through a burning bush, say, it would still be as empirical intuitions. And so there's no way of certifying that God has really spoken to us in our experience. However, there is an absoluteness to the dictates, the commands of morality, the moral law. And for Kant, what religion is seeing the sacredness, the holiness of goodness, of the good. And for Kant, that is the real, genuine metric through which you could recognize God as good and God as God. So there's a statement that often, I think, gets misinterpreted, and this will speak to the hallelujah aspect of what you were talking about. There's a statement in the Groundwork where Kant says that even the Holy One of the Gospels must first be compared to our idea of morality to be recognized as such. A lot of people then kind of take that as, see, Kant's trying to sort of shoehorn religion down to something lesser, to be deflationary. But notice what's going on there. The last two words of that sentence are as such. We can only recognize Jesus or Christ as Christ through this. So in some of his lectures, Kant calls Christ the archetype of all morality.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. And
Does
just
that ever get translated as prototype? Because I've also seen him refer to Christ as prototype, and
yeah.
It's not an insignificant difference.
Yeah, no, exactly. And there's a really good book by two Kant scholars, Chris L. Firestone and Nathan Jacobs, called In Defense of Kant's Religion. They're scholars who kind of agree with me about how to interpret Kant. They get on the translation, I believe it's Wood and Di Giovanni translation of that. It's Urbild. It should be archetype. I'm pretty sure. I can check the German if we want to kind of talk more about that. So a lot of what Kant's doing is like all throughout his philosophy, but in the orientation essay and here in the Theodicy essay, is he's trying to say, look, if you really are serious about wanting to be religious, you have to then reflect on what it is that we can sincerely believe and what sort of belief we often pass off as being belief. So the faith of Job, which he calls weak but pure, is really the model of faith. So if you guys both like Kierkegaard, I often find it useful to kind of talk about those two philosophers. Who is the ideal man of faith for Kierkegaard?
It's either Abraham or Job.
Yeah, it's Abraham. or at least I don't know Kierkegaard as well, but right, the one that everyone talks about is Abraham.
In Fear and Trembling, it's Abraham, and in Repetition, it's Job.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'll have to read Repetition because for Kant, it's Job.
Yeah, what's really interesting, and I wish maybe someone has done a paper on this or has done a book on it, but it seems like Kant covers Job in like 2 or 3 pages in this Theodicy essay, whereas then I wonder if Kierkegaard picked up on that and was like, no, because it seems like the way that Kant understands Job is that Job's faith was still built on a moral foundation, and so you have his friends taking this sort of doctrinal, speculative, rational sort of critique of him, but the way that Kant seems to square the circle, the way that I interpret it, is that he says that Job is given some glance of higher wisdom, that perhaps he's given even a greater insight into the moral plan, and there isn't this teleological suspension of the ethical. There's just, for Job, a greater clarification of it, and he clings to that, whereas Kierkegaard is not going to give Job that insight. Like, Job just goes with it and just clings to God because he has prioritized the love of God over everything else.
Can I jump in on that?
Please do. Please do.
I actually think Kant's reading is closer to Kierkegaard's.
Okay, go on.
Kant's interested in Job, how Job behaves before God shows up, because that's our predicament. That's our human condition.
Yes.
Bad things happen to good people all the time. There doesn't seem to be any discernible justice to our lives. So this is the Kant's big target, or who he's subtweeting, I think, are a lot of like Leibnizian sort of philosophers of his day, who we tend not to read anymore because Kant's critique of their extravagant metaphysics was seen as so devastating. Moses Mendelssohn called him the all-pulverizing Kant, the alles zermalmen. It sounds more fun in German, right? Crushing into powder. He crushed metaphysics into powder. Why is he doing that? Because these Leibnizian scholars thought that you could just look out into nature and you could see God's justice at work in the world. You could just see it, right? That God has arranged everything for the best, and this is the best of all possible worlds. And Kant is someone who was deeply, one of the people like Voltaire, who is deeply disturbed by the Lisbon earthquake in 1755, I think it was. This horrible calamity where many, many people perished, women, children, good, bad people alike, while they were praying in church after confession.
Right.
So they had just been cleansed of their sins. He was deeply disturbed by that. Some people called this event the beginnings of modern atheism. And so Kant is writing in a context where he's trying to say, well, what does it mean to believe in this kind of a world? And he turns to Job as being an exemplar of how to move forward and think about your existential situation. One thing that he also says in the Theodicy essay is that nature is a closed book to us, again, contrary to the Leibnizians. So it's not that Job gets a special insight into things, and then that is what grounds his faith. It's not that at all. It's that Job is scrupulous and honest with himself about what he can really know and what he can tell as being really important. And what he sees as being really important is integrity. Till I die, I will not remove mine integrity from me. That's the part of Job that Kant really likes a lot. And the thing about God showing up and revealing to him nature, Kant says that he reveals it in both its orderly sides and its chaotic sides, its purposiveness and its contra-purposiveness. So the stuff about like the Leviathan in Job, right, it's showing us that nature seems to be untamable and wild and doesn't just sort of bend to our will. Contrary to what all these Leibnizians say, And so what Kant takes that to signify is that we should not be bothering ourselves with trying to theoretically prove that this world is a just place. What matters is that we make it a more just place. And we cannot continue to persevere in the hard work of making the world a more just place without some hope that eventually, and we don't need to understand when or how, but that eventually our strivings will bear moral fruit. And this is the highest good, as he calls it.
So why do you think, I guess the thing that I'm trying to, if Job isn't given a special insight into the moral reality of the universe, I do recall, sir, he's given these conflicting nature of the order of things in the Leviathan. We're actually, at Noetic, we're actually going to do a read-through of Job because it's becoming such an important part for Kant and Kierkegaard and Jung and other authors that I think it's just, I've read some sections here and there, but I think something else that I've noticed is that Kant and Kierkegaard take different departure points from Job. So I think I just need to read it in whole to make sure I have an integrative understanding of it. But the thing is like, why wouldn't Job, on the Kantian understanding, indict God on some level? Because he's I guess Job doesn't know about the wager that has gone on, right? But Job knows that he's a morally upright man, and Job attributes, he says, the Lord gives and taketh away, and blessed be the name of the. He knows the Lord is, whether or not he knows the specifics about how Satan was allowed to harm him except for killing him and all this other stuff. He ultimately brings it all back to God. Why he wouldn't, from a rational moral perspective, indict God on some level, unless given that greater moral insight into the nature of things?
So repeat the question again.
Well, Job knows what it means to be a moral agent,
right?
A moral man, and he understands that God is fully in control and is doing something that seems to defy the human understanding of what morality is, right? He attributes all this wrath and all these deaths and everything back to God. Why he doesn't, unless he has a greater insight that's given it to him in that encounter with God, why he doesn't indict God on moral grounds?
Oh, well, yeah, if I can just say something from the text, he kind of does a little bit. I mean, and it depends on what we mean by indict. So one thing that Kant zeroes in on in Job for praise is Job's frankness, right?
Yes.
Unlike Job's friends, who are toadies, they're yes men, right? They just say what they think God wants to hear for the fire insurance. Job tells it like it is, okay? And I think this is what Kant really admires, is that Job would complain to God about how God doesn't seem to be holding to his nature. That's how committed Job is to the idea that if God exists, God has to be just. That he'll tell God to his face that he needs to live up to his nature as being just. And the word that gets translated as frankness in our translation is Frechheit in German. Job gets fresh with God. He's cheeky. He'll give God the middle finger. And what happens in the story? God comes down and says, "That's my boy," right? Because that's the person who really has faith. When even when it seems like they're going to be punished by God for being truthful, they still are truthful anyway. That's the kind of character God demands from us, and that's really what God wants out of us. Not our worship and kind of glorification and all that stuff that he shouldn't need anyway, but for us to tap into that capacity within ourselves, that moral capacity for integrity, and to stick fast to that, and to hold firm to that, even when all the chips are down. I think one thing that is, if I can sort of plug two books that I think maybe useful here. The first is Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which is not, I mean, he's a very intelligent author. Maybe he's read Kant. But even if he hasn't, it's a very Kantian story about a father and son making their way through this post-apocalyptic landscape where it's the end of the world, basically. And there is no social or material benefit to being a good person. All the food sources in the world have dried up. It seems like the only food source to turn to is other human beings, cannibalism. And that is the distinguishing line between morality and immorality in the book, between being one of the good guys, as the son puts it, because he's a little boy, and being one of the bad guys. And it's really interesting, the theological aspects of that book. The other book that I'll plug is this one. I don't know if you can see it. It's On Job by Gustavo Gutierrez, God Talk and the Suffering of the Innocent. Gutierrez is mostly known as the founder of liberation theology, but in this book he talks about Job. And it's a very slim book. It's very short. It's very readable. It's about 100 pages of very readable stuff. And one thing that strikes me is how very Kantian Gutierrez's reading is. Even though he never mentions Kant, for Gutierrez, what Job is a book about is about how to talk about God in the face of all this unjust suffering, the suffering of all these innocent people. So the conclusions that he comes to are very, very similar. That if you look at the opening of the book of Job, what does Satan say? He says, the only reason anybody ever has faith is they're hoping for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
Right.
Right? And Kant found that abhorrent, as the author of Job implicitly seems to as well.
And Kierkegaard would find that problematic.
Oh, sorry?
I'm saying Kierkegaard would find that problematic as well. Yes.
Could you say more about that? I'm just curious.
Because I think ultimately Kierkegaard is interested in the individual forming a subjective relationship in this temporal scenario. And there are parts of other discourses and things like that that if he were to able to have some sort of perspective where everybody else was spirited away into heaven and yet he found himself in the pit of hell, he would still praise God's justice. So the outcome doesn't really matter. It's something he can never know. Mm-hmm. And like, he loves God that much that even if it's adjudicated that he doesn't get to heaven or something like that, it ultimately doesn't matter. So the purity of heart is there. It is all based on this. But there is this distinction where the tension is that Kierkegaard loves God more than he loves human conceptions of morality, and that's why there starts to be, I think, daylight between the two interpretations of Job.
So if I can put on my Kant hat and speak to Kierkegaard, right? I would say, okay, well, so what does it mean to praise God, right, or to love God, if you don't think of God as fundamentally good, right? So one thing that you can kind of see this as, just a human conception. Really what Kant is doing is he's saying that it turns out secretly that that concept we have of morality is actually divine. But you can't start from there. Because if you start from there and you base morality on theology or religion, it ruins both morality and religion.
Right.
It makes people's faith mercenary, and it also, I mean, this is stock, pretty kind of common stuff, intuitive stuff to us nowadays. Which religion do you start with? Which sacred scripture is really sacred? All these sort of things that seem to depend on human bias. Not to mention, people who drown their children in bathtubs because God told them to do it, apparently.
That's why you have fear and trembling, man.
Yeah.
Fear and trembling.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, no, so there really is a kind of, they are at cross purposes there. It should be said, too, that, right, there's multiple ways of reading that story. One of which is that Abraham failed God's test. Do you know about this way of reading it?
Oh, wait. So, I mean, wait. Well, I mean, go on.
I think I flustered you. Yeah. So child sacrifice was often demanded by a lot of religions of the day, the religions surrounding the Jewish people. And Abraham thinks that God is that petty, that immoral, that tyrannical, that he would demand the same thing. Yeah. And so he actually fails God's test. God was testing him to see whether he would really go through with such a horrendous conception. So that's how some people read the Abraham story.
Yeah, now, man, we can go off on so many tangents on that. I do wanna keep it trained here because we do have a lot of stuff to keep going. Honestly, God, I love your brain, Joseph, and I'm getting such an education from you. I think just very quickly, if you could, maybe for Kant's definition or Kant's understanding of Job, which you would say that Job has some sort of authentic theodicy, whereas perhaps his toady friends perhaps have this doctrinal theodicy. They were sort of representatives of that, and just how formal conscientiousness enters into those different types of theodicy.
Well, maybe it would help to just look at the passage. So let's look at the passage that talks about formal and material conscientiousness. So this is on page 27 of this English edition. I'm a Kant scholar. It's a sickness. I always want to talk about the marginal numbers too, because it's the original German. So this is at 267 to 268. One cannot always stand by the truth of what one says to oneself or to another, for one can be mistaken. However, one can and must stand by the truthfulness of one's declaration or confession, because one has immediate consciousness of this. For in the first instance, we compare what we say with the object in a logical judgment through the understanding, whereas in the second instance, truthfulness, where we declare what we hold as true, we compare what we say with the subject before conscience. Okay, so we see a dichotomy going on here between the subject and the object. Conscience pertains to my own self as a subject. Knowledge is about an object outside of me. Yeah? That's truth. Inwardly, though, there's truthfulness. And that phrase, what one holds as true, in German that's für wahr halten, holding to be true, of which Kant says there are three kinds, opinion, knowledge, and faith. Should I say a little bit about these, because it may help?
Yes, I think they would.
Yeah, so on the one hand, you have faith, and on the other hand, you have knowledge and opinion. And all three of these are ways of holding something to be true, or taking it to be true. Knowledge and opinion belong on a spectrum. Okay, and faith is all the way over here for Kant. So what's the difference between knowledge and opinion? Knowledge is what we can prove to be true. We have to be able to prove something to be true in order to count it as knowledge. We can give conditions for the conditioned. Opinions, on the other hand, can be idle speculations, right? Is there life on other planets? A subject that Kant really cared a lot about, actually. Extraterrestrial intelligence is something he talks about quite often, and this is part of why he always talks about rational beings and not just human beings, because he did think it's possible that there's rational beings out there. Now, is there extraterrestrial intelligence? Well, there might be, but we don't have any confirmation of this. So it's an opinion. If we got confirmation of it, it would then become knowledge. See how that works? Okay?
Mhm.
Faith is something very different. Okay? It's not opinion, because it's not the sort of thing that could ever become knowledge.
Precisely.
Okay? It is just in and of itself unprovable. But even more than that, it doesn't need to be proved. And Kant is vigorously, just strenuously, railing against people who treat faith like it's knowledge. So in the prefaces to the Critique of Pure Reason, he says, I found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. That's the B preface, marginal number 30. He doesn't want us to have knowledge that God exists. That's the interesting thing, too. Kant is not just saying we can't prove that God exists, even though we want to prove that. He's saying that the very want or desire to prove that God exists would undermine morality, and it would undermine faith.
Well, I think you can understand why I'm laughing a little bit, because he is going to offer practical proofs, or a practical proof for God's existence, right?
Can I be? This is where, if I wore glasses, I would push the glasses up the bridge of my nose. Actually, no. Some places he calls it proof, and I kind of wish that he hadn't. There's a difference between a proof and a postulate. So what is that? A postulate is a term taken from geometry, where you sort of say, let there be this sort of thing, and then you proceed from that. It allows you to kind of make headway. That's what Kant wants.
Right.
So he postulates God's existence, but that is very different than a proof. Now, sometimes he'll call it proof, and why does he do that? Well, because he's trying to say that there's a certain form of certainty to it, moral certainty, which is different than logical certainty.
Oh, let me tell us the difference.
And this article that I have about touchstones of conviction actually gets into the nitty-gritty of Kant, tying himself into some jargonistic knots in how he does this. But that's the basic thing with his project. And what he's trying to do with Job, and all these Leibnizians who are attempting to give a theodicy, a sort of doctrinal theodicy, they're trying to prove that God exists and prove that God is just. And what that winds up doing is it puts God in a box of theoretical reason, where he then is something that is a piece of knowledge that has no impact on how we live our lives. And for Kant, that's really repellent. And it makes our relationship with God, or whatever is out there in the noumenal, a mercenary one, and one that redounds to our own intellectual prowess. And Kant found that really repellent. In that respect, he comes out of a pietist background, and I can yap a lot about that. So, shall we get back to the formal and material conscientiousness?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. So, were we to make our declaration with respect to the former, okay, that's truth, and as opposed to truthfulness. Were we to make our declaration with respect to truth without being conscious of the latter, truthfulness, then we lie, since we pretend something else than what we are conscious of. So we're taking something to be true even though we know that we don't really have conviction about it. And for Kant, the opposite of conviction is persuasion, Überredung, which means kind of talking yourself into something. We think it's believable-ish, you know. The observation that there is such an impurity in the human heart is not new. For Job already made it. He made this observation, that there's lots of people who kind of say that they believe something, but it's half-hearted. You know, it's just kind of what they say when someone sticks a microphone in their face and says, "Do you believe in God?" Yeah, people are like, "Yeah, sure."
Yeah, there's a higher power. Yeah, totally.
Right. But do you really have belief if you then are a terrible person, think that it doesn't matter how you live, that God will forgive you no matter what you do, In some sense, grace is very important for Kant, but it cannot be what Bonhoeffer called cheap grace. Because if you basically think that God's grace will just kind of operate inside you, take over like some kind of demonic possession, and make you a better person without you doing anything. There's a criticism of that in Rousseau's Emile, where he says, this is like expecting God to do the work so that I can collect the wages for it. So
it seems like Kierkegaard might have taken this as a bit of a departure point. The individuals who half-heartedly believe something to be true might fall more along the lines of what he would call objective truth, whereas the individual who's more authentic and sincere and honest, such as Job, might be a representative of that which is subjectively true, or that's or an individual within that subjectively true relationship. Because when people ask me if I believe in God, it's not like sure, it's like I love the Lord.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, for Kant, part of that too, though, is if it's really going to be love, it has to be disinterested.
You want me to disinterestedly love God? What? Hey, I want you to continue on this point, so the session doesn't crash. I have to get my charger, so you guys continue on. Okay.
Kant says, yet one is tempted to believe that attention to it, this capacity to be untruthful, one is tempted to believe that attention to it is new to the teachers of morality and religion. One so seldom finds them making a sufficient use of it, despite the difficulty associated with the purification of the dispositions in human beings, even when they want to act according to duty. We can call this truthfulness formal conscientiousness. Material conscientiousness consists in the caution of not venturing anything on the danger that it might be wrong, whereas formal conscientiousness consists in the consciousness of having applied this caution in a given case. Okay, so material conscientiousness is where we've been really cautious about whether we can be, whether we can hold something truthfully. And formal conscientiousness is this sort of apperception or awareness in ourselves that we have been that scrupulous. Does that make sense?
I think so. So formal conscientiousness. So formal conscientiousness is a good thing. That's what I want to.
Well, yeah, they're both good things. They're both good things. The danger for Kant is letting concern for the truth override the duty to being truthful. And he thinks that's the snare or the trap that the Leibnizians and the Job's friends lapse into.
So in terms of who has which consciousness, so do Job's friends have a material conscientiousness? Which one is he?
Oh, no. No.
They have the formal conscientiousness.
Yeah, because, and how could they, right? So how could they really know where Job stands with God? I mean, they even admit, oh, he's a virtuous man, right? And yet they just kind of start spouting this stuff that they know is just the party line. So they haven't been truthful. They're not really sincere in saying that they think God is just and will accord to everybody happiness in proportion to virtue, right? They haven't really been honest with themselves. They've just been saying what they think God wants to hear, what they know they're supposed to conclude. So I think the Kantian sort of rejoinder to a lot of, I don't want to say Kierkegaardian, I want to say maybe certain evangelical propensities, is to say, can you really believe this? Is it really possible to sincerely believe that everything happens for a reason, as people say? We can hold out the hope that everything is ultimately working towards a kind of just plan. But you can't really honestly look at the world and see what a pretty terrible place it is, and truthfully say, oh yeah, everything that's going on, that this is everything clicking along as it's supposed to. You can't act like you know that. You can honestly hope for that, and you can say, well, I hope this is the case, but you can't know that in a sort of Panglossian optimism.
Okay, I think we might have that distinction down now. We probably should get into the prefaces.
Can I make a suggestion, Luke?
Sure.
Do we want to cut this off as sort of like a appendix, as like this is sort of appending what's come before, and make this its own standalone, and do the prefaces on as their own recording? Because at this point we're probably pushing an hour.
Right.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, well let me just end this, and then I'll send you guys another link.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, 1 second.
Uh-huh.